A millionaire rescued a blind girl abandoned on Christmas and raised her as his daughter for 8 years. But one day, when he came home earlier, he discovered something shocking about his wife. Snow fell softly over the quiet city, covering the deserted streets with a cold white blanket. Paul Mercier, a 40-year-old man with tired eyes and an impeccable suit, watched the flakes dance through the window of his luxurious mansion. The clock on the wall read 11:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, but the festive spirit seemed to have completely abandoned the place. Paul sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. His cell phone vibrated again. It was Claire, his wife, and sending a brief message. "Sorry, darling, the meeting ran late. Don't wait up for me." He tossed the device onto the sofa, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. Another Christmas alone. Unable to bear the oppressive silence of the mansion, Paul decided to take a walk. He put on his warmest coat and stepped out into the cold night, his footsteps echoing on the empty streets. With no destination in mind, he let melancholy guide him until he reached a small park in the city center. That's when he heard it, a barely audible sound muffled by the snow. A sob. Intrigued, Paul followed the sound to a bench partially covered in snow. There, huddled and shivering, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, her blonde hair tangled and dirty, her little face red from the cold and tears. "Hello?" Paul called softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. The girl turned her face toward him, but her eyes weren't focusing on anything. That's when Paul realized she was blind. "Who's there?" The girl's voice was trembling, frightened. Paul felt his heart tighten. "My name is Paul. I won't hurt you, I promise. What are you doing here all alone on Christmas Eve?" The girl sniffled, clutching a worn-out teddy bear to her chest. I don't know. The lady left me here. She said she'd be right back, but it's been so long." Paul felt a wave of anger and compassion wash over him. Who would abandon a child, especially a blind one, in a park on Christmas Eve? Without a second thought, he took off his coat and wrapped it around the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Leia," she replied, her voice a bit steadier now that she felt the warmth of the coat. "Well, Leia, how about we go somewhere warm? I can get you some hot chocolate, and we can try to find your family." Leia hesitated for a moment, but then reached out her little hand to Paul. "You promise you won't leave me alone again?" The question hit Paul like a punch in the gut. At that moment, looking at this fragile, abandoned child, something inside him changed. All the coldness and loneliness that surrounded him seemed to melt away. "I promise, Leia. I won't leave you alone." Carefully, Paul picked Leia up, feeling her tremble against his chest. As he walked back to his mansion, 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. What would Claire say? How would he explain the presence of an abandoned child in his home? And most importantly, how could he help Leia? Upon arriving home, Paul prepared a warm bath for Leia and improvised clean clothes with one of his t-shirts. While the girl took her hot chocolate, he made several calls to the police, to social services, even to his lawyers. But it was Christmas Eve, and no one seemed willing to deal with the case of an abandoned child that night. When the clock struck midnight, Paul looked at Leia, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, clutching her teddy bear. At that moment, Paul made a decision that would change his life forever. "Merry Christmas, Leia," he whispered, covering her with a soft blanket. "Tomorrow will be a new day for both of us." Little did Paul know that his impulsive decision to shelter Leia that Christmas night would be just the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and family. And as the snow continued to fall outside, inside the once cold and empty mansion, a small flame of hope began to flicker. The Christmas morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Mercier mansion, illuminating the sleeping figure of Leia on the living room sofa. Paulus, who had barely slept, watched the girl with a mix of concern and tenderness. The past 24 hours had turned his world upside down. "What am I doing?" he murmured to himself, running a hand over his tired face. As if answering his silent question, Leia stirred, her unfocused eyes opening slowly. "Did Santa come?" she asked, her voice sleepy and hopeful. Paul's heart tightened. "Leia, dear, it's Paul. Do you remember me?" Reality seemed to hit the girl, her little face contorting for a moment before lighting up with a hesitant smile. "Paul, you didn't leave me. No, I didn't, he replied softly, helping her sit up. And I won't. I promise. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Paul. Between calls to social services, consultations with lawyers, and frustrated attempts to locate any of Leia's relatives, he found himself immersed in a world completely new to him, caring for a young, blind child. Leia, be careful with the... Paul didn't finish his sentence before hearing the sound of breaking glass. He rushed to the kitchen to find Leia standing amidst shards of a broken glass, looking scared and about to cry. "I'm sorry, Paul," she sobbed. Paul sighed, carefully picking her up to avoid the shards. "Don't worry, dear. It wasn't your fault. We'll need to make some adjustments around here, won't we?" While cleaning the floor, Paul made a mental note to research how to make the house safer and more accessible for Leia. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he barely heard the sound of the front door opening. "Paul, I'm home." Claire's voice echoed through the mansion. Paul froze, the broom still in his hand. For a moment, he had completely forgotten about his wife's return. Claire entered the kitchen, her expression shifting from surprise to confusion as she saw Leia sitting at the table. "Paul, who is this child?" Before Paul could respond, Leia turned toward the voice. "Hi, I'm Leia. Are you Paul's wife?" Claire looked at Paul, silently demanding an explanation. He took a deep breath, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. "Claire, dear, can we talk in private for a moment?" In the office, Paul quickly explained the events of Christmas Eve. Claire's expression oscillated between shock, disbelief, and something Paul couldn't quite decipher: irritation, fear. "You brought a stray child into our home." "Paul, what were you thinking?" Claire hissed, trying to keep her voice low. "What else could I do? Leave her to freeze in that park?" Paul replied, feeling defensive. Claire ran a hand through her hair, clearly agitated. "No, of course not, but, Paul, we can't just adopt a child like this." "I'm not talking about adoption, Claire. It's temporary, until we find her family or what?" Claire interrupted. "And what if we don't find anyone? Have you thought about that?" The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unresolved tension and unanswered questions. Finally, Claire sighed. "Look, I understand that you wanted to help, but this is too big, Paul. We're not prepared for this." Paul looked at his wife, noticing for the first time the weariness in her eyes, the lines of worry on her forehead. He wondered when they had grown so distant. "I know we're not prepared, Claire. But Leia needs us now. Can't we at least try?" Claire hesitated, her gaze wandering to the closed office door, as if she could see through it to the little girl sitting in the kitchen. Finally, she nodded slightly. "All right. But only until we find a permanent solution. And you'll have to handle all the legal aspects of this." Paul felt a momentary relief, but also a pang of disappointment at Claire's reluctance. He hoped that, over time, she could open up to Leia as he had. In the days that followed, the tension in the Mercier house was palpable. Claire, though polite to Leia, maintained an emotional distance that the girl, even blind, seemed to sense. Paul juggled caring for Leia, continuing his search for her family, and trying to keep his marriage intact. One afternoon, while Paul was making another series of calls in his office, he heard a scream from the living room. He rushed in to find Claire standing, looking horrified at a broken vase on the floor, and Leia cowering in a corner, crying. "What happened here?" Paul asked, rushing to comfort Leia. "She was walking around the room and bumped into the pedestal," Claire explained, her voice tense. "Paul, this can't go on. Our house isn't safe for her." Paul hugged Leia, who was sobbing apologies. "Then we'll make it safe," he replied, his voice firm. "Claire, we can make this work. We just need to try a little harder." Claire looked at her husband and the crying child in his arms, an indecipherable expression on her face. Without saying a word, she turned and left the room. That night, after putting Leia to bed, Paul found Claire on the balcony looking out at the snowy garden. "I'm sorry about the vase," he said softly. Claire didn't turn around. "It's not about the vase, Paul. It's about everything. Our lives have been turned upside down in a matter of days." Paul approached, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. "I know, but maybe..." Maybe this change is what we needed. Claire finally looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And what if we don't find her family, Paul? What then? Paul looked back at the house, thinking of the little girl sleeping inside, who in such a short time had become so important to him. Then, he said softly, maybe we are the family she needs. The silence that followed was filled with possibilities and unspoken fears. As the couple sat on the balcony, contemplating an uncertain future inside the house, Leah slept peacefully, oblivious to the changes her arrival had set in motion and the decisions yet to come. The weeks following Leah's arrival were a whirlwind of changes in the Mercier mansion. The house, once a symbol of luxury and sophistication, gradually transformed to accommodate the needs of its new temporary resident. Paul, determined to provide the best environment possible for Leah, threw himself into research about caring for blind children. One morning, Claire found him surrounded by books and printed articles, his eyes red from exhaustion. "Did you sleep, Paul?" she asked, a mix of concern and irritation in her voice. Paul looked up, a gleam of enthusiasm in his tired face. "Claire, did you know there are toys specifically designed to stimulate the sensory development of blind children? And methods for teaching orientation and mobility? We need to adapt the house, put tactile markers, organize the furniture in a specific way." Claire watched her husband, feeling a pang of something she couldn't name. Was it admiration for his dedication, or fear of the changes to come? "Paul," she interrupted softly, "it sounds like a lot. Remember, this is temporary. We can't completely transform our lives." Paul's smile faltered for a moment. "I know, Claire, but as long as Leah is here, she deserves the best we can offer." The days that followed saw a series of adaptations. Tactile strips were placed on the walls to guide Leah, braille labels appeared on doors and drawers, and a carefully planned routine was established. Claire, initially reluctant, found herself gradually drawn into the process. One afternoon, as she helped Leah get dressed, the girl touched her face gently. "You have a beautiful voice, Claire," Leah said with a smile. "So I like it when you read stories to me." Claire felt her heart melt a little. "Thank you, Leah. Would you like to read more tonight?" "Yes, please," Leah replied, her smile widening. As the days turned into weeks, Claire oscillated between moments of tenderness for Leah and waves of anxiety about the changes in her life. She watched Paul playing with the girl in the garden, teaching her to recognize different flowers by touch and smell, and felt a confusing mix of emotions. One night, after putting Leah to bed, Claire found Paul in his office, on the phone again. "No, we still don't have any information about her family," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "Please, keep looking. There must be someone." When he hung up, Paul noticed Claire standing in the doorway. "Still nothing," he said, rubbing his tired face. Claire approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Paul, it's been almost 2 months. Maybe there isn't anyone looking for her." Paul looked at his wife, a mix of sadness and determination in his eyes. "I can't accept that, Claire. Someone must be missing her. Someone must be searching." Claire hesitated before speaking. "And if they aren't, what then?" The question hung in the air, heavy and filled with implications. Meanwhile, Leah thrived under Paul's care. She learned quickly, her curiosity and determination impressing everyone. Paul spent every free moment with her, teaching her, playing with her, exploring the world through her other senses. One sunny Sunday afternoon, Claire watched from the balcony as Paul and Leah painted in the garden. Paul had created paints with different textures and scents, allowing Leah to experience art in a unique way. "Don't look, Claire," Leah shouted excitedly, holding up a paper covered in colorful, textured splotches. "I made a rainbow I can feel." Claire smiled, but felt a pang in her chest. The scene before her was of a perfect family, except she felt like an outsider. That night, as Paul read a bedtime story to Leah, Claire watched from the door. The intimacy between the two was palpable, and Claire felt a wave of jealousy that surprised her with its intensity. "And they lived happily ever after," Paul concluded softly. Leah yawned, snuggling into her blankets. "Paul," she murmured sleepily, Will you always be my dad, no matter what? The silence that followed was deafening. Claire saw Paul freeze, his emotions clearly in conflict. Leia, dear, he finally replied, his voice trembling. I will always be here for you, no matter what happens. Claire stepped back silently, her heart pounding. Leia's words and Paul's response echoed in her mind, bringing to the surface fears and insecurities she had tried to suppress. Later, in the couple's bedroom, Claire finally expressed her fears. Paul, I'm worried, she began, her voice low. Leia is getting too attached to you, and you to her. What will happen if we find her family? Or if we decide we can't keep her permanently? Paul looked at his wife, the pain evident in his eyes. Claire, I can't deny that I care deeply for Leia. She brought something into our lives that we didn't even know was missing. And what about me? Claire asked, her voice breaking. Where do I fit into this new life you're building with her? Paul moved closer, taking Claire's hands in his. You are my wife, Claire, my partner. I want us to do this together. Leia needs both of us. Claire closed her eyes, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm scared, Paul. Scared of getting attached and then losing. Scared of the changes. Scared of not being enough. Paul hugged her tightly, feeling the tremor of her suppressed sobs. I know, my love. I'm scared too. But maybe that fear means that what we're doing is important, that it's worth it. As the couple embraced, seeking comfort in each other amidst the uncertainty, in the next room, Leia slept peacefully, unaware of the emotional turmoil her presence had stirred. The search for Leia's family continued without results, and with each passing day, the possibility of a permanent solution, whatever that might be, became more real and frightening. The Mercier mansion, once a symbol of material wealth, now radiated something much more valuable, the warmth of a true family. Autumn arrived at the Mercier mansion, painting the garden trees in shades of red and gold. 3 months had passed since Leia entered their lives, and the temporary situation began to feel more permanent. One evening, after putting Leia to bed, Paul found Claire in the living room, looking thoughtfully out the window. He took a deep breath, knowing the conversation he was about to initiate would change their lives forever. Claire, he began, his voice soft but determined. We need to talk about Leia. Claire turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a mix of apprehension and resignation. What is there to talk about, Paul? We still haven't found her family. Paul moved closer, taking Claire's hands in his. That's what I want to talk about. Claire, I think we should consider adopting Leia permanently. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions. Claire withdrew her hands from his, taking a step back. Adopt? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Hey, Paul, you can't be serious. Why not? Paul replied, a hint of challenge in his voice. Leia is already part of our lives. She loves us, and we love her. What difference does it make to make it official? Claire shook her head, incredulous. What difference does it make? Paul, this would change everything, our life, our plans, our future. Do you really want to take on the responsibility of raising a blind child for the rest of our lives? Paul felt Claire's words hit him like a punch in the gut. You make it sound like a burden, he said, his voice sad. Leia is a blessing, Claire. She brought so much joy into this house. For you, maybe, Claire interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. But what about me, Paul? Have you ever stopped to think how I feel, seeing you and Leia so close, building this bond that I'm not a part of? Paul was taken aback by Claire's sudden outburst. I didn't know you felt this way, he stammered. Why didn't you ever say anything? Claire laughed bitterly. Say what? That I'm jealous of an orphaned, blind child? That I feel like an outsider in my own home? That I'm afraid of losing you? Tears began to stream down Claire's face, and Paul felt his heart break. He took a step toward her, but Claire held up a hand, stopping him. No, Paul, I can't do this. I can't just throw away everything we planned, everything we built, for a child who fell into our lives by chance. Paul felt a surge of frustration and anger. By chance. Claire, you really believe that? Leia chose us. She needs us. And what about me? Don't I need you? Doesn't our marriage matter? Claire shouted, her voice breaking. The silence that followed was deafening. Paul and Claire stared at each other, both shocked by the intensity of their emotions. At that moment, a small noise caught their attention. They turned to see Leia standing in the living room doorway, her teddy bear clutched to her chest, silent tears streaming down her face. "Talia," Paul whispered, his heart aching at the sight of the distraught child. "Are you fighting because of me?" Leia asked, her voice trembling. I can go away. I don't want to cause trouble." Paul rushed to Leia, kneeling to hug her. "No, dear. You're not going anywhere. This isn't your fault." Claire watched the scene, feeling torn between compassion for Leia and resentment toward the situation. She knew she should go over there, comfort the child, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. "But you were shouting," Leia sobbed against Paul's chest. "Claire doesn't want me here." "I heard her." Paul looked at Claire, his eyes pleading silently for her help. Claire hesitated for a moment before approaching slowly. "Leia," she said softly, touching the girl's shoulder. "It's not that I don't want you here. It's just complicated." Leia turned toward the sound of Claire's voice, her unfocused eyes shining with tears. "Don't you like me?" The question hit Claire like an arrow. She felt her own tears begin to fall. "Oh, Leia," she whispered, pulling the girl into a hug. "Of course I like you. It's just that I'm scared." Paul watched, his heart aching, as his wife and Leia embraced. He wanted desperately to fix everything, to take away the pain of both, but he knew it wouldn't be that simple. In the days that followed, the tension in the Mercier house was palpable. Paul and Claire barely spoke to each other, communicating only when necessary, usually about Leia-related matters. The girl, in turn, became more quiet and withdrawn, clearly sensing the strained atmosphere. One afternoon, while Paul was working in his office, Claire entered hesitantly. "Paul," she began, her voice low, "I think we need to consider other options for Leia." Paul looked up, alarmed. "What kind of options?" Claire took a deep breath before continuing. "There are institutions specializing in children with visual impairments, places where she could receive professional care, proper education." "No," Paul interrupted, his voice firm. "I won't send Leia to an institution. She needs a family, love, or not professional care." "And are we that family?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Paul, look at us. We can barely communicate. Our marriage is falling apart. How can we offer Leia what she needs if we don't even know what we need ourselves?" Paul stood up, walking to the window. Outside, he could see Leia sitting on the garden swing, gently swaying, her face turned toward the autumn sun. The sight made his heart ache. "I know it's not easy, Claire," he said finally, turning to face his wife, "but I can't give up on her. I can't send her to a place where she'll just be another abandoned child. She deserves more than that." Claire approached, tears shining in her eyes. "And what about us, Paul? What do we deserve? When was the last time we thought about ourselves, about our future?" Paul took Claire's hands in his, feeling the tremor in her fingers. "Our future is right there, Claire," he said softly, indicating Leia in the garden. "If only we could see it together." Claire withdrew her hands gently, taking a step back. "I need time, Paul, to think, to process all this. I can't make such a big decision right now." Paul nodded, feeling a weight in his chest. "I understand. Take the time you need. But, Claire, please don't give up on us. On all of us." As Claire left the office, Paul turned his attention back to Leia in the garden. The girl had stopped swinging and was now facing the house as if she sensed she was being watched. Paul knew the coming weeks, perhaps months, would be crucial. The decision they made would not only affect Leia's future, but theirs as well. As he watched the small, solitary figure on the swing, Paul made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he would do everything in his power to ensure that Leia never felt abandoned again. Winter arrived, covering the city with a blanket of white silence. Inside the Mercier mansion, the air was filled with expectation and apprehension. After weeks of tense discussions and sleepless nights, Paul and Claire finally decided to have a definitive conversation about Leia's future and their family. Sitting in the living room, each holding a cup of hot tea to ward off the cold, the couple faced each other, both nervous about what was to come. Claire was the first to break the silence. "Paul, I've been thinking a lot these past weeks. About us, about Leia, about our future." Paul nodded, encouraging her to continue. "So it hasn't been easy," Claire went on, her voice trembling. "I've had to face a lot of my fears and insecurities, but I've realized something important. Leia is already part of our lives, whether we like it or not." Paul felt a spark of hope. "What are you saying, Claire?" Claire took a deep breath before answering. "I'm saying that I'm willing to give it a real try, to give the three of us a chance as a family." The relief Paul felt was so intense, he almost dropped his cup. "Oh, Claire," he whispered, tears shining in his eyes. "You don't know how much this means to me. To us." Claire held up a hand, stopping him. "But I have conditions, Paul. We need to do this together, as a team. It can't be just you and Leia, with me watching from the outside. And we need professional help, both for Leia and for us as a couple." Paul nodded vigorously. "Yes, of course. Anything you want. We'll do this together, I promise." That night, they called Leia for a family talk. The girl entered the room hesitantly, clearly sensing the charged atmosphere. "Leia, dear," Paul began softly, "Claire and I have something important to tell you." Claire knelt in front of Leia, taking her small hands in hers. "Leia, we would like to adopt you officially, to make you a permanent part of our family. What do you think about that?" Leia's face lit up with a radiant smile. "Do you want to be my real parents?" she asked, her voice overflowing with hope. "Yes, dear," Paul replied, joining them on the floor. "If you want, of course." Leia did not answer with words. Instead, she threw herself into the arms of Claire and Paul, hugging them with all the strength her little body could muster. In that moment, wrapped in Leia's tight embrace, Paul and Claire felt for the first time in months truly united. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The Mercier mansion underwent a complete transformation to become a truly accessible home for Leia. Experts were called in to install tactile guidance systems, braille labels were placed throughout the house, and even the garden was redesigned with raised beds and fragrant plants to stimulate Leia's senses. Claire, determined to fulfill her promise to be more involved, threw herself into the preparations. She spent hours researching education for blind children, attending workshops on braille, and even learning orientation and mobility techniques to help Leia. One afternoon, while Paul watched from the balcony, Claire and Leia were in the garden, exploring the new, fragrant plants. "This is rosemary," Claire explained patiently, guiding Leia's hand to touch the leaves of the plant. "Can you smell it? It's used to season food." Leia inhaled deeply, a smile spreading across her face. "It smells like the chicken you made yesterday." Claire laughed, surprised by the genuine joy she felt. "Exactly. You have a very good nose, Leia." Paul felt his heart warm at the scene. It was the first time he had seen Claire and Leia interact so naturally and affectionately. As the days went by, the family dynamic began to change subtly. Mealtimes, once silent and tense, became moments of lively conversation and laughter. Leia began to open up more, sharing her thoughts and feelings with both parents. One evening during dinner, Leia surprised everyone with a question. "Can I call you Mom and Dad now?" The silence that followed was brief, but filled with emotion. Claire was the first to respond, her voice choked up. "Of course you can, my love. Nothing would make us happier." Paul watched, amazed, as Claire pulled Leia into a tight hug. It was as if a final barrier had finally fallen. The family therapy sessions, initially uncomfortable, began to bear fruit. Paul and Claire learned to communicate their fears and insecurities more healthily, and Leia began to process her past traumas with the help of a therapist specializing in visually impaired children. One Saturday afternoon, while the family was gathered in the living room, Claire had an idea. How about we play a board game designed for us three to play together?" she suggested, pulling a box from the shelf. The game, with textured pieces and braille cards, provided hours of fun. Laughter echoed through the house, filling spaces that had once felt so empty and cold. That night, after putting Leia to bed, Paul found Claire on the balcony, looking at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, joining her. Claire smiled. a genuine smile that Paul hadn't seen in months. "I'm thinking about how our lives have changed, about how I've changed." Paul put his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Changed for the better?" Claire nodded, snuggling closer to him. "Definitely. You know, Paul, I was so afraid of losing our life, our freedom, but now I realize we haven't lost anything. We've gained a whole world." Paul felt tears of joy welling up in his eyes. "And I love you so much, Claire, and I love our family." "I love you too," Claire replied, turning to face him. "And I love our daughter." As the couple kissed under the starlit sky, inside the house, Leah slept peacefully, a soft smile on her lips. The Mercier mansion, once a symbol of material wealth, now radiated something much more valuable: the warmth of a true family. The challenges did not end, of course. There would still be difficult days ahead, adjustments to be made, obstacles to be overcome. But now, united as a family, Paul, Claire, and Leah were ready to face whatever the future held. The journey that began on a cold Christmas night had led to a destination none of them could have predicted, but which they now embraced wholeheartedly. The years passed like pages of a book being turned by the wind, each one bringing new experiences, challenges, and joys to the Mercier family. The mansion, once a cold monument to wealth, now pulsed with the life and love of a growing family. Leah, the frightened little girl who arrived on a Christmas night, blossomed under Paul and Claire's care. Her round, childish face gave way to more defined features, and her once tangled blonde hair now fell in soft curls to her shoulders. At 8 years old, she moved through the house with a confidence that surprised everyone who knew her. One spring morning, Paul watched from the balcony as Leah navigated the garden expertly, her fingers lightly brushing the braille labels that identified each plant. "Dad," she called, her face lit up with a smile. "The roses are already blooming. I can smell their perfume." Paul smiled, marveling at his daughter's ability to perceive the world around her. "You're right, my love. Would you like to pick some to put on the dinner table?" While father and daughter busied themselves selecting the best roses, Claire watched them from the kitchen window. Her relationship with Leah had evolved over the years, but there were still moments when she felt like an outsider in the girl's life. Claire tried her best to be a good mother. She helped Leah with her studies, read to her every night, and even learned Braille to better communicate with her daughter. Yet, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible barrier that kept her from fully embracing the maternal role. "You don't have to be perfect, you know." Paul's voice surprised her, pulling her from her thoughts. He had entered the kitchen with Leah, both carrying bouquets of fresh roses. Claire forced a smile. "I know. It's just that sometimes I feel like I'm always one step behind the two of you." Paul approached, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're a great mum, Claire. Leah adores you." As if to confirm Paul's words, Leah approached Claire, offering her a rose. "Mum, I chose this one especially for you. It has the strongest scent, just like your favorite perfume." Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes as she accepted the flower. "Thank you, dear. It's perfect." The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. Paul, ever the shrewd businessman, found ways to balance his professional life with his role as a father. He set up an office at home, allowing him to spend more time with Leah. Often, while working on financial reports, Leah would sit silently beside him, her fingers gliding over a braille book. "Dad," Leah asked one day, looking up from her book, "what do the letters you use look like? Are they different from mine?" Paul smiled, taking Leah's hand and guiding it over the words on his report. "They are a bit different, yes. See, each letter is made up of straight or curved lines. These small interactions, these moments of shared curiosity and learning, were the moments Paul valued most." Claire, for her part, channeled her energy into becoming a tireless advocate for inclusive education. She worked with the local school to implement programs for visually impaired children, ensuring that Leah could attend regular classes with the necessary support. "Mom," Leah said one evening, while Claire helped her with homework, "Sarah invited me to her birthday party on Saturday. Can I go?" Claire hesitated for a moment. The idea of Leia at a party full of sighted children made her anxious. "Are you sure you'll be okay, dear? There will be lots of people, lots of noise." Leia smiled, her confidence evident. "I know, Mom, but Sarah said she'll introduce me to all the guests personally, and I promised to stay close to her the whole time." Claire felt a mix of pride and apprehension. Her daughter was growing up, becoming more independent with each passing day. "All right then, but call me if you need anything, okay?" As Leia approached her 9th birthday, it became increasingly clear that her visual impairment was just one aspect of who she was, not something that defined her. She played the piano with a skill that amazed her teachers, her musical sensitivity compensating for her lack of sight. In school, she excelled in math and science, her agile mind easily grasping abstract concepts. One autumn afternoon, the family was gathered in the living room. Paul was reading the newspaper, Claire was flipping through a magazine, and Leia was playing with a three-dimensional puzzle. "Done!" Leia exclaimed suddenly, holding up the completed puzzle. "I managed to put it together in less than 5 minutes this time." Paul lowered his newspaper, smiling proudly. "Incredible, my love. You're getting better and better at this." Claire watched the scene, feeling a wave of love and pride that surprised her with its intensity. At that moment, seeing Leia's radiant smile and Paul's adoring look, she felt something shift inside her. The emotional distance she had maintained for so long began to dissipate. "Hey, how about we celebrate?" Claire suggested impulsively. "We could have a picnic in the garden. I'll make those sandwiches you love, Leia." Leia's face lit up at the suggestion. "Really, Mom? Can we bring the puzzle too so you can try to put it together?" Claire laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Of course, dear, but I'm not sure I can beat your record." As the family headed to the garden, Paul took Claire's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. No words were needed. The look they exchanged said it all. And as they walked, Leia leading the way with her white cane, Paul felt a profound sense of gratitude and love. The sound of Leia's laughter echoed through the garden as she ran ahead, her cane expertly guiding her path. Paul and Claire followed, hand in hand, their hearts full of love and gratitude for the unexpected gift that had transformed their lives in ways they never could have imagined. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, the family settled into their impromptu picnic. The future, with all its challenges and possibilities, awaited. But at that moment, enveloped in the warmth of familial love and the sweet scent of Leia's roses, they were exactly where they belonged. Autumn arrived at the Mercier mansion, bringing not only the changing leaves but also a subtle shift in the family atmosphere. Paul, always attentive to details, began to notice small changes in Claire's behavior that, at first, seemed insignificant, but soon began to accumulate in his mind like pieces of a troubling puzzle. It all started one seemingly ordinary morning. Paul was preparing breakfast for Leia, now 8 years old, when Claire rushed into the kitchen, her cell phone glued to her ear. "Yes, I understand. No, I can't talk right now. I'll call you back later," she whispered quickly before hanging up upon noticing Paul's presence. "Everything okay, dear?" Paul asked, raising an eyebrow. Claire smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, just work. You know how it is." Paul nodded, not entirely convinced, but let it go. However, in the days that followed, similar scenes repeated themselves. Claire seemed always to be on the phone, speaking in a low voice and abruptly ending conversations when someone approached. One afternoon, while Paul was helping Leia with her homework in the living room, the girl made an innocent observation that set off an alarm in his mind. "Dad," Leia began, her fingers pausing over the Braille book. "Mom's been on the phone a lot lately, hasn't she? Last night I heard her in the office. She sounded worried." Paul tried to keep his voice neutral. "Oh, and what else did you hear, dear?" Leia furrowed her brow, concentrating. "Not much. Just heard her say something about not being able to go on like this and needing more time. Do you think she's having trouble at work?" Paul felt a knot form in his stomach. "I'm sure it's nothing, love. Let's get back to your homework, okay?" But Leia's words echoed in his mind. In the days that followed, Paul began to pay more attention to Claire's movements. He noticed she was going out more frequently, always with the excuse of work meetings or commitments related to the inclusive education projects she had been developing. One evening, while they were having dinner, Claire announced, "I'll have to travel next week. A conference on special education in the capital." "Oh," Paul replied, trying to sound casual. "For how long?" "3 days," Claire said, avoiding his gaze. "Maybe 4, depending on how things go." Leah looked disappointed. "But Mom, you promised to take me to the piano concert on Saturday." Claire seemed genuinely regretful. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. Maybe your dad can take you." Paul watched the interaction, noticing the slight tremor in Claire's hands as she cut her food. Something was definitely not right. After putting Leah to bed that night, Paul decided he needed to investigate. He hated the idea of invading Claire's privacy, but the fear and uncertainty were beginning to gnaw at him from the inside. While Claire was taking a bath, Paul quietly entered the office. Her laptop was on the desk, the lock screen glowing softly in the dim light. Paul hesitated for a moment before trying the password, Leah's birthday. To his surprise and concern, the screen unlocked. With his heart racing, Paul began to search through Claire's emails and documents. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Work reports, correspondence about the inclusive education projects, invitations to lectures. But then, in an apparently innocent folder labeled Personal, Paul found something that made his blood run cold. It was a series of emails exchanged with a name he didn't recognize. The messages were vague, but the tone was intimate, full of references to secret meetings and future plans. Paul felt the world spinning around him. Could Claire be? The sound of the bathroom door opening made him quickly close the laptop and leave the office. When Claire entered the bedroom, Paul was sitting on the bed, pretending to read a book, his heart pounding in his chest. "Everything okay, dear?" Claire asked, noticing his tense expression. Paul forced a smile. "Yes, just tired." "It's been a long day." That night, lying next to Claire, Paul couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with questions and theories, each one more painful than the last. He wanted to confront Claire, demand the truth, but the fear of what he might discover paralyzed him. The days that followed were torture for Paul. He watched Claire's every move, analyzing every word, looking for clues or confirmations of his suspicions. At the same time, he tried to maintain a facade of normality for Leah, not wanting to disturb the peace they had worked so hard to build. One afternoon, while Claire was out at one of her meetings, Paul found himself back in the office, this time with a more defined purpose. He knew he was crossing a line, but the need to know the truth overrode any moral scruples. With trembling fingers, he opened the email folder again, determined to find out more. It was then that he noticed something he had missed in his first hurried search. Some of the emails mentioned Leah. "I understand your concern about Leah, but I believe the time has come to..." Paul felt the air escape his lungs. What was Claire planning? What did this mean for their family, for Leah? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made him close everything quickly. When Claire entered the house moments later, Paul was in the living room, pretending to help Leah with her piano lesson. "Hello, my loves," Claire called out cheerfully, but Paul noticed an underlying tension in her voice. As he watched Claire hug Leah and ask about her day, Paul felt a mix of love, fear and determination. He loved his family more than anything, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. But now, facing the possibility that the greatest danger might come from within, Paul knew he had difficult decisions ahead. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the room. As the soft notes of Leah's piano filled the air, Paul wondered how much longer he could maintain this facade of normality and, more importantly, what he would discover when he finally confronted the truth. October 15th dawned, with a palpable sense of expectation in the air. It was Leah's 12th birthday, and Paul had planned a special surprise for his daughter. Deciding to leave work early, he carried an elaborate cake and carefully chosen gifts. As he approached the mansion, Paul noticed an unfamiliar car parked in the driveway. His heart raced, the suspicions of the past months rushing back in full force. Silently, he entered the house, the muffled sounds of voices coming from the office guiding his steps. The office door was slightly ajar, and what Paul saw through the crack shattered his world. Claire was in the arms of a man, exchanging passionate kisses and whispered words that Paul couldn't make out. For a moment, Paul was paralyzed, unable to process the scene before him. It was the sound of Claire's voice that brought him back to reality. "Thomas, we have to tell the truth. I can't go on like this." The man, Thomas, sighed deeply. "I know, my love. But what about Leah? How will she react?" The mention of Leah's name was the trigger. Paul pushed the door open with force and making it bang against the wall. Claire and Thomas separated abruptly, the shock evident on their faces. "Paul!" Claire gasped, her face pale with horror. You weren't supposed to be at work." Paul felt a wave of anger and pain so intense he could barely speak. "It's our daughter's birthday, Claire, our daughter." His voice trembled with contained emotion. "How could you?" Thomas took a step forward as if to explain, but Paul cut him off with a sharp look. "Get out of my house, now." There was a moment of tense silence, Thomas looking at Claire as if seeking guidance. Claire, however, seemed to have lost the ability to speak. "Go, Thomas," she finally whispered. "But please." When Thomas left, the silence that followed was deafening. Paul and Claire stared at each other, years of love, trust, and now betrayal hanging between them. "How long?" Paul finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. Claire closed her eyes, tears escaping from beneath her lids. 3 years, she admitted in a whisper. The answer hit Paul like a punch in the gut. 3 years, half the time since they had adopted Leah. "Why, Claire? Why do this to us? To Leah?" Claire opened her eyes, a mix of guilt and defiance in her gaze. "Do you really want to know, Paul?" "Because I felt suffocated. Because while you and Leah had this incredible bond, I always felt like an intruder in my own family." Paul shook his head, incredulous. "We built this family together, Claire. We faced all the challenges together. How can you say you felt like an intruder?" "Because that's how I felt," Claire shouted, years of resentment finally surfacing. "You were the perfect dad, always knowing exactly what Leah needed. And me? I was always one step behind, always insecure, always feeling inadequate." Paul felt his anger mix with a deep sadness. "Why didn't you ever tell me this? We could have talked, could have worked it out together." Claire laughed bitterly. "Talk? When, Paul? Between your business meetings and your time with Leah, when was there space for me?" The argument continued, years of frustrations and unspoken grievances coming to the surface. So absorbed were they in their confrontation that they didn't notice the small figure standing in the office doorway. "Mom? Dad?" Leah's trembling voice cut through the air like a knife. Paul and Claire turned abruptly, the horror etched on their faces as they realized their daughter had heard part of the argument. Leah stood in the doorway, silent tears streaming down her face. Her eyes, though sightless, seemed fixed on a point between her parents, as if she could see the pain and anger that filled the space between them. "Are you fighting because of me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No, dear," Paul hurried to say, moving to embrace Leah. "We're just talking." Claire also approached, hesitantly. "Leah, my love, But Leah stepped back from both their touches. "I heard you," she said, her voice surprisingly firm for someone so young. "Mom said she felt like an intruder because of me. And there's someone named Thomas." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with guilt and regret. Paul and Claire exchanged desperate looks, realizing the depth of the pain they had caused their daughter with their thoughtless words and actions. "Leah," Claire began, her voice choked with emotion, "I'm so sorry. I never wanted—" But Leah interrupted her. "Is it my birthday?" she said simply, as if that explained everything. And, in a way, it did. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, of family, of love. Instead, it had turned into a nightmare. Paul felt his heart break at the sight of his daughter's pain. "Leah, dear, we can fix this. We love you so much. You know that, right?" Leah did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a maturity beyond her years. "I want to be alone now, please." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, her white cane guiding her down the hallway to her room. The sound of her door closing echoed through the silent house, marking the end of innocence and the beginning of a new and uncertain phase for the Mercier family. Paul and Claire stood in the office, the reality of what they had done finally hitting them with full force. The birthday cake, forgotten in the entrance, was a cruel reminder of the day that should have been and the day that really was. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the mansion, the Mercier family faced their darkest night. The revelations of that day had shaken the foundations of everything they had built together, and the path ahead seemed uncertain and frightening. The only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same. The days following the discovery of Claire's betrayal were a blur of intense emotions and awkward silences in the Mercier mansion. Paul wandered through the rooms like a ghost, his face marked by sleepless nights and tormented thoughts. Every corner of the house seemed to scream with memories of a happiness that now revealed itself to be an illusion. One morning, as he stared at his untouched coffee cup, Paul heard the hesitant steps of Leah approaching the kitchen. His heart ached at the sight of his daughter's pale face and swollen eyes. "Good morning, dear," he said softly, trying to inject some normality into his voice. Leah murmured a barely audible response, sitting down at the table with slumped shoulders. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words and painful questions. Finally, Leah spoke, her voice trembling. "Dad, is it my fault that you and Mom are fighting?" The question hit Paul like a punch in the gut. He rushed to kneel beside Leah, taking her hands in his. "No, my love, never think that. The problems between your mum and me have nothing to do with you." But Leah shook her head, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I heard Mom say she felt like an intruder because of me, if you hadn't adopted me." "Stop," Paul interrupted her gently but firmly. "Leah, you are the best thing that ever happened to us, never doubt that." As he held his sobbing daughter, Paul fought back his own tears. How had they come to this point? How could they have let things go so far that Leah blamed herself for their problems? That afternoon, after ensuring Leah was resting in her room, Paul confronted Claire in the office. She was sitting at the desk, staring blankly at the computer screen. Though it was clear she wasn't really seeing anything. "We need to talk," Paul said, his voice filled with exhaustion and determination. Claire looked up, and Paul was struck by the guilt and sadness evident in her gaze. "About what? Haven't we said everything there is to say?" Paul shook his head. "Not everything. Leah blames herself for what's happening, Claire. She thinks it's her fault." Claire closed her eyes, a look of pain crossing her face. When she opened them again, there was a resolution in her gaze that Paul hadn't seen in a long time. "Paul, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice low. "Something I should have said a long time ago." What followed was a confession that shook Paul to his core. Claire revealed that, from the beginning, she had never felt completely comfortable with adopting Leah. The fear of not being a good mother, the insecurity in dealing with a blind child, and the constant feeling of inadequacy had gnawed at her heart all these years. "I tried, Paul," Claire said, tears streaming down her face. "I tried so hard to love Leah like you love her, but there was always this voice in the back of my mind telling me I wasn't good enough, that I would never be the mother she deserved." Paul listened, stunned. Part of him wanted to shout, accuse Claire of selfishness, of betraying not only him, but also Leah. Another part, however, began to understand the weight Claire had been carrying silently all these years. "And why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "We could have sought help, found a way." Claire shook her head sadly. "I was ashamed, Paul, ashamed of not being the perfect mother you and Leah deserved. And the more time passed, the harder it became to admit the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. Paul felt torn between anger at Claire's betrayal, compassion for her silent suffering, and fear of what this meant for their future, especially for Leah. "What do we do now?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Claire looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of regret and resolution. "I don't know, Paul, but I know we can't go on like this. It's not fair to any of us, especially not to Leah." At that moment, as if summoned by their words, they heard a muffled sob coming from the office doorway. Turning, they saw Leah standing there, silent tears streaming down her face. "Leah," Claire gasped, standing up abruptly, How long have you been there? Long enough, Leah replied, her voice trembling. Don't you love me, Mom? The question hung in the air, filled with years of unspoken pain and unrequited love. Claire moved toward Leah, but the girl stepped back. Leah, Claire began, but the words seemed hollow, even to her own ears. Paul watched the scene, his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. He wanted to protect Leah, console her, tell her everything would be all right. But how could he when he himself was no longer sure of anything? And what about me? Leah asked, her voice surprisingly firm. Do you want me to go away? The question hit Paul and Claire like a physical blow. They stared at their daughter, the pain and confusion in her eyes reflecting their own inner turmoil. No, Leah, Paul said, his voice trembling with emotion. We would never want you to go away. You are our daughter, and we love you more than anything. Leah looked from one parent to the other, her sightless eyes seeming to see right through them. Then why are you fighting? Why is everything so complicated? Paul and Claire exchanged a desperate look, realizing the depth of the pain they had caused their daughter with their actions and words. They had tried to shield her from the truth, but in doing so they had only made things worse. Leah, Claire said, her voice choked with tears, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I love you, I truly do. But sometimes love isn't enough to fix everything. Leah stood silently for a moment, processing her mother's words. Then, with a maturity far beyond her years, she spoke. I know, Mom. I know love isn't always enough. But we have to try, don't we? We have to try to make things right. Paul felt a surge of pride and love for his daughter. In the midst of all this pain and confusion, Leah was showing a strength and wisdom that humbled him. You're right, Leah, he said, his voice filled with determination. We have to try, and we will. And we, together. As the family stood in the office, the weight of their secrets and omissions finally lifted. They knew the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long time, they felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And with Leah's love and forgiveness guiding them, they took the first tentative steps toward healing and reconciliation. The dawn found the Mercier mansion immersed in a heavy silence. Paul had not slept, spending the night in vigil outside Leah's door, fearing she might try to run away. Claire, for her part, had isolated herself in the guest room, leaving Paul alone with his tormented thoughts. When the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, Paul heard the soft sound of Leah's door opening. He stood up quickly, his heart racing. Leah, he called softly. The girl paused, her face turned toward the sound of his voice. Her eyes, though sightless, were swollen from crying. Dad, she said, her voice hoarse, we need to talk. Paul felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Of course, dear. Let's have breakfast and talk, okay? In the kitchen, as Paul prepared breakfast, Claire entered hesitantly. Leah, sensing her presence, tensed. Can I join you? Claire asked, her voice trembling. There was a moment of tense silence before Leah nodded slightly. Paul indicated for Claire to sit down, and the three found themselves at the kitchen table, the air heavy with unspoken words and painful truths about to be revealed. It was Leah who broke the silence. I want to know everything, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. About Mom's affair, about my adoption. Everything. Paul and Claire exchanged apprehensive looks. Claire took a deep breath, knowing it was time to reveal the whole truth. Leah, my love, Claire began, her voice trembling. The man well, he isn't just someone I met recently. He might be part of your past. Paul felt his heart race, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in his mind. Claire continued, tears streaming silently down her face. His name is Thomas. He might be your biological father, Leah. The silence that followed was deafening. Leah sat motionless, her face a mask of shock. Paul felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. How? Paul finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. Claire closed her eyes, as if the memory was too painful to bear. When we adopted you, I did some investigating on my own. I discovered that Thomas might be your biological father, but he didn't know of your existence at the time. I sought him out to inform him, but you fell in love with him," Leah completed, her voice eerily calm. Claire nodded, unable to speak. Paul watched the scene, feeling like a spectator in his own life. "Why didn't you tell me?" Paul asked, the pain and betrayal evident in his voice. "I was afraid," Claire admitted, "afraid of losing you, afraid of losing Leah." And the more time passed, the harder it became to tell the truth. Leah, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I want to meet him," she said, her voice firm. "I want to know my biological father." The words hit Paul like a punch in the gut. "Leah," he began, his voice choked with emotion, "I am your father. In every way that matters." Leah turned toward the sound of his voice, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I know, Dad, you will always be my father, but I need to understand where I came from." Paul felt his heart break. He had always known this day might come, the day Leah would want to know about her origins. But he never imagined it would be like this, surrounded by lies and betrayals. And what if... Paul hesitated, barely able to form the words. "What if he wants custody? What if I lose you, Leah?" The question hung in the air, heavy and frightening. Claire sobbed silently, the guilt evident in every line of her face. Leah reached out, finding Paul's hand and squeezing it tightly. "You will never lose me, Dad. You are my father, no matter what happens." Paul felt a mix of love, fear, and determination. He knew that the decisions they made now would not only affect Leah's future, but theirs as well. And as he looked into his daughter's sightless eyes, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he would fight for her. He would do everything in his power to ensure she never felt abandoned again. "Leah," he said softly, "I will support whatever decision you make. If you want to meet Thomas, I will be by your side." Claire looked at Paul with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Paul," he raised a hand, interrupting her. "This doesn't change what you did, Claire. But right now, what matters is Leah." Leah sobbed, throwing herself into Paul's arms. "Thank you, Dad. I love you so much." "What do we do now?" Claire asked hesitantly. Paul took a deep breath, looking from Leah to Claire. "Now we face this together. As a family. I don't know how, but we will find a way." The sun of the morning now flooded the kitchen, illuminating the faces marked by the sleepless night and tears. Outside, the world continued to turn, oblivious to the drama unfolding within the Mercier mansion. The family stood on the brink of a precipice, about to plunge into the unknown. The truths had been revealed, and now they had to navigate treacherous waters, facing not only the past but also an uncertain future. As Leah rested in Paul's arms, Claire watched them, a mix of regret and hope in her eyes. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and painful decisions. But in that moment, united by love and truth, they took the first step toward healing and reconciliation. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. And perhaps, just perhaps, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. For from the ashes of destruction, something new and stronger could emerge. The journey would be long and difficult, but they would face it together, one day at a time. The weeks following Claire's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions. The Mercier mansion, once a refuge of love and security, now felt suffocating with the weight of truths unspoken and choices imminent. One afternoon, while Paul was working in his office, trying to distract himself with business matters, Claire entered silently. Her face was pale but determined. "Paul," she began, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." Paul looked up, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He knew, even before Claire spoke, what she was about to say. "You're leaving, aren't you?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm. Claire nodded, tears shining in her eyes. I can't go on like this, Paul. It's not fair to you, to Leah, or to myself. I'm going to live with Thomas." Despite expecting it, Claire's words hit Paul like a punch. Years of love, shared memories, and dreams for the future seemed to crumble before his eyes. "And Leah?" Paul asked, his voice barely a whisper. Claire closed her eyes, as if the question caused her physical pain. "I love Leia, Paul." "You know that, but I think she'll be better off with you, at least for now." Paul felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that Claire wasn't trying to take Leia away from him, and anger that she could even consider leaving her daughter behind. "You realize what you're doing, Claire? You're abandoning our daughter." Claire sobbed, but held her ground. "I know it looks that way, Paul, but I believe it's the best for all of us right now. Leia needs stability, and you can provide that for her better than I can at this moment." Before Paul could respond, they heard a soft sound coming from the door. Leia was standing there, her face a mask of calm that contrasted painfully with the situation. "You're going away, Mom?" Leia asked, her voice surprisingly firm. Claire approached Leia, gently touching her face. "Yes, my love, but it doesn't mean I don't love you. I just need some time to figure some things out." Leia nodded slowly, as if processing the information. Then, to Paul and Claire's surprise, she turned to Paul. "It's okay, Dad. We'll be all right." Paul felt his heart swell with love and pride for his daughter. Even in the midst of so much pain and confusion, Leia was showing a maturity and strength beyond her years. In the days that followed Claire's departure, Paul found himself navigating uncharted waters. He was now a single father to a preteen blind girl, trying to balance her emotional needs with his own still raw wounds. But the real storm was just beginning. 2 weeks after Claire's departure, Paul received a legal notification. Thomas, Leia's presumed biological father, was filing for custody. The fear that Paul had been holding at bay exploded into full-blown panic. The idea of losing Leia was unbearable. She was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he couldn't imagine his life without her. That night, after putting Leia to bed, Paul sat in the living room, the legal notification in his trembling hands. It was then that he heard the soft steps of Leia coming down the stairs. "Dad," she called softly. "Is everything okay?" Paul tried to force a light tone into his voice. "Yes, dear, just thinking about some things." Leia approached, sitting down beside him on the sofa. "Is it about Thomas, isn't it? He wants my custody." Paul was surprised by Leia's perceptiveness. "How do you know that?" Leia shrugged. "I heard you talking on the phone earlier. Dad, I want you to know that no matter what happens, you will always be my father." Tears welled up in Paul's eyes. He pulled Leia into a tight hug, feeling her small body tremble slightly. "Thank you, my love," he whispered. "But I want you to know that I will fight for you. I won't give up without a fight." Leia nodded against his chest. "I know, Dad. And I will fight with you." In the days that followed, Paul found himself immersed in a flurry of meetings with lawyers, preliminary hearings, and preparations for what promised to be an emotionally draining legal battle. The custody process turned out to be even more complicated than Paul had imagined. The adoption of Leia, though legally sound as, was now under scrutiny due to the unique circumstances of the case. The fact that Claire had hidden the identity of Leia's possible biological father for all these years added layers of legal and ethical complexity to the situation. In the midst of it all, Leia showed a constant source of strength and determination. She insisted on participating in the meetings with the lawyers, offering her perspective and making it clear that she wanted to stay with Paul. "I understand that Thomas might be my biological father," Leia said during one of these meetings, her voice firm despite her youth. "But Paul is my father in every way that matters. He raised me, loved me, and supported me in every moment. It is with him that I want to stay." The lawyer, impressed by Leia's eloquence and maturity, assured them that her words would carry significant weight in the process. As the weeks turned into months, Paul and Leia adapted to their new reality. Their nights were filled with frank conversations about the past, the present, and the uncertain future that awaited them. Paul was constantly surprised by Leia's resilience and understanding. "You know, Dad," Leia said one night as they sat in the garden, "sometimes I think that all of this happened for a reason. Maybe we needed to go through this to realize how strong our bond is." Paul felt his heart swell with love and pride. "You're amazing, you know that. I don't know how I could have gotten through all this without you." Leia smiled, squeezing Paul's hand. "We're a team, Dad, always will be." As Paul held Leia's hand, he felt a mix of love, fear, and determination. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, But together they could face anything. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the love between father and daughter, forged through years of dedication and now tested by the fire of adversity, was stronger than any biological tie or court decision could ever be. Winter arrived in Paris, covering the city with a blanket of white silence. In the courtroom, Paul and Leah awaited, hands clasped tightly, the decision that would change their lives forever. Months of legal battles, emotional testimonies, and sleepless nights culminated in this moment. When the judge finally delivered his verdict, Paul felt as if the world had stopped for an instant. Considering all the evidence presented and, most importantly, the well-being of the child in question, this court decides to maintain the legal adoption of Leah Mercier by Paul Mercier. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. Paul pulled Leah into a tight embrace, tears of relief and joy streaming down his face. Leah, now 13 years old, returned the hug with equal intensity. "It's over, Dad," she whispered. "We're together." Across the room, Thomas, Leah's presumed biological father, watched the scene with a mix of sadness and resignation. After months of legal battle, he finally understood that the bond between Paul and Leah was stronger than any biological tie could ever be. As they left the courtroom, the snow falling softly around them, Paul looked at Leah, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "And now, my dear, what do you want to do?" Leah smiled, her face lit up in a way Paul hadn't seen in months. "Let's go home, Dad. Let's start over." In the days and weeks that followed, Paul and Leah embarked on the journey of rebuilding their lives as a family of two. The Mercier mansion, once filled with memories of pain and betrayal, was gradually transformed into a home that reflected their new reality. One afternoon, as they decorated the Christmas tree together, Leah paused, holding an old ornament in her hands. Dad," she began hesitantly, "do you think we'll ever be able to forgive Mom?" Paul breathed deeply, considering the question. "Forgiveness is a journey, Leah. Maybe one day we can... But for now, the important thing is that we're together and we love each other." Leah nodded, hanging the ornament on the tree. "I know, Dad. And I love you more than anything." As they finished decorating the tree, the house filled with the warmth of their love and the promise of a new beginning. The future was uncertain, but together they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. That night, as they sat by the fireplace, the Christmas lights casting a soft glow over the room, Paul felt a profound sense of peace. He looked at Leah, her face illuminated by the gentle light, and felt an overwhelming love and gratitude for the gift of their family. "You know, Leah," he said softly, "what we have is more precious than any material wealth. It's love, pure and unconditional." Leah smiled, snuggling closer to her father. "I know, Dad, and I'm so grateful for every moment we have together." As they sat in the warmth of their love, the world outside faded away. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. And so, under the starlit sky and the soft glow of the Christmas lights, Paul and Leah embraced the promise of a new beginning, ready to write the next chapter of their lives with love, courage, and unwavering faith in each other.